It's my pleasure, to chair this morning session on renewable energy. And when we talk about renewable energy, it is, inseparable comparison from fossil fuel. So let me just, start off with some nominal statistics that we ought to know. I mean, the first thing is, of course, how much of fossil fuel reserve do we have? Now, the BP statistical review of world energy last year has estimated that Saudi Arabia, which has got about 15.7% of the total reserve, has got the reserve to production ratio of about 61 years. So in other words, we have got 61 years of fossil fuel left there. And if you compare with the OPEC countries, which comprise of about 71.4% of the total reserve, and in that, the reserve to production ratio is about 87%. Now, when we talk about renewable energy, let me also talk about the new capacities that are added every year. And last year, of all years, it was actually solar, PV solar, which was the highest, and they had 47% of the total addition. And then, of course, it was wind. And in total, last year, we had quite a huge addition of the installed capacity of around 161 gigawatts, which was, of course, 9% increase. Now, with all this, now energy, new installed energy net, we compare with the economic growth. Now, on global scale, an estimate of 3% of economic growth is there. And this was, in spite of all the CO2 emissions from fossil fuel and industries, and it remained fairly stable. And why did it actually remain stable in the face of increasing energy demand? Because there was an influx of renewable energy. As one of those, there was a decline in coal consumption, and of course, there was an improved energy efficiency. And with all this, coming close to the small island developing states, now we are trying to, there was an upsurge, in fact, of the energy policies that have been coming in. And of course, Fiji, as we say, they have said they've got a policy of getting 99% renewable energy generation by 2030. And of that, they say by 2020, we should have 100% electrification. Now, these are some of the things, and likewise in Tonga, they say that we reduce the fossil fuel by, say, 50% by 2020. Now, with all these, what actually drives this renewable energy deployment is the mitigation of climate change, the energy security, and of course, the new jobs created and so forth. So this morning, my panel would talk about the renewable energy in states, that is the small island developing states, the penetration it's making, and of course, they will point out whether it's a smooth or a bumpy ride, and the barriers to implementation, the challenges, the constraints, and opportunities. So these all you'll hear from my panel. And ladies and gentlemen, with much pleasure, I now introduce the first speaker, Dr. Evanthine Mikhailina, who is the Adjunct Associate Professor, Sustainability Research Center, University of Sunshine Coast. Thank you.
Thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you, Mr. Kumar, for the introduction. I'm working for the last 23 years in the energy sector, and for the last 10 years, first in the public state utility of my country, Greece, and then to the energy regulator of Greece in the Secretariat for the last 10 years, and a little bit in the European Commission. So I have followed, actually we have imposed the transition from coal to renewable energy in my country, and we have tried to create the useful drivers so as such a transition takes place. So when I first came here in Fiji 2 years ago, I was naturally, professionally, and academically interested to see how this transition is taking place in the Pacific region. And I was extremely interested to see that the energy landscape in the Pacific region is so much different from the rest of the world on so many aspects. I mean, you all know, of course, the aspects. You know the high dependence on solid fuels. You know those environmental hazards and risks that make such a transition very difficult. You know the high cost of renewable energy. I mean, all those problems exist everywhere, but not at that high degree that happen in the Pacific region. So what it is here in this region, to my opinion, is, and because the time is extremely limited, both because of the commitments that each Pacific country has developed in Paris, also both of the environmental hazards that are outside our door and probably inside our house as well, I think that what this region needs is tools. I have noticed there is a lack of tools. So what we have done with a group of researchers that we've been good friends, and they have been great friends, have been great colleagues all those years, we have investigated the matter at 3 levels. Okay, how this transition from coal to renewable energy goes at a local level, at a national level, and at a regional level. How we did that? We have asked the most crucial questions that we think for each level that can influence the implementation of renewable energy. Then for each level, we have identified the challenges, and then we have developed easy to work with tools. So at the regional level, the main question was, do governance drivers lead to renewable energy increase? Let me just make a, I think I should, yeah, it's not here. At the national level, the question was, is it possible to attain national determined contribution targets? And at the local level, the question was, how can renewable energy benefits increase at the local level? So we worked for the regional level first. Okay, what we did notice that renewable energy in the Pacific region is lagging behind compared to global rates. So with the blue line here, you can see how Pacific Islands go, and with the red line, you can see how world goes. On this graph, you can see that less than 250 megawatts of renewable energy have been installed in the last 15 years in the Pacific region. But the most interesting thing is that the FIMAGO, as we call them, drivers. What is FIMAGO? It's a financial market governors, drivers that can push renewable energy forward. They're doing really well. I mean, we have a great governance in place. We have institutional frameworks. We have development aid. We have really everything we need. Okay, and you can see islands like the Solomon Islands in Kiribati, they're doing really well when it comes to the drivers that can push renewable energy. However, you can see here that the islands do not really go well. I mean, even if FIMAGO, the drivers, just going on, you can see that the percentage of renewable energy increase stays low, with the exception of Tokelau. Why Tokelau? Tokelau is 100% renewable, but why? Because it belongs, sort of, to New Zealand. Okay, so they have everything they need just to develop the renewable energy. It's much more challenging for the other Pacific Island states. So what we have noticed at the regional level, FIMAGO, the drivers for renewable energy, are there, but renewable energy is not there. The development partners are founding elements of renewable energy progress in the Pacific Islands. The role of local governance has been neglected in the national renewable energy policy design. And the private sector remains underestimated. And also, there is the need for deeper Pacific regionalism. At the national level, what we have done, we have developed a model for fuels, electricity fuels maximization. So in order to attain the NDC, National Determined Contribution Targets, which are 81% in 2020 and 100% in 2030, by at the same time, having taken into consideration the electricity demand increase, the future electricity demand increase, which is supposed to be 4% for Fiji. Okay, we have run the model. We took data from 2013 from Fijian Electricity Authority. We have worked on Fiji this time. Okay, and we tried to find out which is the optimal and if Fiji can attain the targets. And not only that, we have tried to see at which rate of greenhouse emissions emitted, how much is going to cost, and which is going to be this mix environmentally good for the whole world or not. So those are the scenarios we have developed. I'm not going to spend the time now to explain to you. I just want to give you an overview of what happens in the national picture in Fiji. And this is the global worth mean potential. So probably you can see that in the biomass scenario, it's the biomass scenario, if we inserted too much biomass in the Fiji, then it's going to be very bad for the environment overall. And here is the most interesting slide. You can see that if we inject full solar in the system, it's going to be the most expensive scenario. Okay? So what we have noticed out of this national research on national level, can Fiji attain the targets? No way. I mean, even if Fiji has committed to attain the targets for 2030, there is no way they can do that. Look at that. They have to add 640 megawatts of wind. I mean, that's not possible. We have 10 up to now. Or if we add only biomass, we're going to be high in environmental impact. We can add advanced renewable energy technologies like OTEC, geothermal energy, but Fiji is quite financially and technically mature, I think, for these technologies. By any means, they're not going to insert it by 2020. So there is a solution if we start to phase out diesel in 2020. So shut up diesel plants, which needs very, very careful planning because there's always the risk for blackouts. So at a national level, we say that we notice that Fiji should not just rely on renewable energy to attain the targets. Maybe it should have an optimized mix of solid and renewable energy fuel and, to our opinion, to best interplay with energy efficiency to attain the targets at a cost which is tolerable for Fijian society, because that's the most important thing. And that additional parameters should be taken into consideration, like grids, which is a very important issue for Fiji, and probably the focus on renewable energy for mitigation purposes is not the only way towards sustainable energy futures. And that last point takes me to the third part of the research we have done with my colleagues, the local level. Okay? We were wondering, how can renewable energy benefits increase at a local level? We have surveyed 2 remote off-grid villages of the Beka Island in Fiji. The Nadeva, where solar systems are implemented in houses for the last 5 months, and the Rukwa, where they have a central system implemented there for 5 years. We have then identified crucial climate change adaptation dimensions. So we have created a renewable energy resilience framework. And you can see down that the resilience dimension out of the renewable energy which is already implemented in Beka is quite low. You can see all the dimensions, okay? They're quite low. So what we noticed at the local level, we noticed that, believe it or not, the more solar we introduce to the villages, the more the diesel increases, okay? We call this energy rush. And we also noticed what Ostrom said, that when they have some energy, solar energy, everybody's rushing to buy fridges, etc., etc. So this follows to shut up of everything, really. Okay? So they need to buy more diesel because they have fridges and they have to do something to keep them working. Okay? The other things we noticed is that there is no interface between society and technology. This means practically that they have no idea on how they can use the renewable energy for adaptation purposes. Local communities in Beka, they have never been told how to use this huge tool they have there for free, so as they increase their adaptation benefits. And of course, we notice there is an unsustainable tariff setting. So, we are here to propose some solutions based on our models. I have to say from the beginning that our data was very limited. We couldn't find sufficient data to proceed to the perfect modeling. I wish we had the means and the data to do a better work, but at least I will give you an idea of models that can be used in the region to just keep things going. And I will start with the regional level. So what we have noticed, we noticed that we can build a regional renewable energy development model. So you can see that on the basis of two indicators, governance and finance. It's a very, very interesting thing. You can have a great, consistent development renewable energy model. You can have some islands are beginners, and slowly, slowly the renewable energy market matures, and they can become veterans. So for example, on the finance aspect, we have the beginners, they have some renewable energy project constructed by financial foreign aid, whereas at the last stage of their maturity, they have implemented financial mechanisms for people to pay their bills. So knowing that there is a consistent path from immaturity to maturity, decision makers, national decision makers, can make better their decisions, and private sector can feel more confident. At the national level, what we did is that we took all the data we could find available, and we have played a bit with the energy efficiency. So we have we have seen how this electricity optimization fuel mix works with 1% electricity demand in the future until 6% electricity demand in the future. So we see that the more the electricity demand from people increases, then the more megawatts we will have. However, you can see that the more the electricity demands increases, the more pollution we will have, and the more cost. So we have worked on the model, and we have found the best energy efficiency rate where things can work. It's submitted now to publication, so as we have a scientific opinion on our work. But still, I just repeat, we were based on the available data. So this can be developed even further and give us outstanding results, knowing exactly which energy efficiency measures we should implement the following years, combine them with renewable energy, combine them with the solid fuel in place, and then take into consideration parameters on grid aspects and all that, and then create the perfect model that can tell us exactly what we should do to attain Fiji targets for 2020-2030. And of course, this model can work for all Pacific islands of the region. At the local level, and this is my last level, we understood that we need to use renewable energy, and we need to teach people how to use renewable energy for climate change adaptation purposes. So what we have done, we have created again a model there, which we called MMM model. It's Management, Maintenance, Monitoring, Renewable Energy Model. This concerns specific management, maintenance, monitoring interventions, which we propose, we suggest, or the government can suggest to local communities, so as to increase their adaptation to climate change through renewable energy. And this is the result. We have done a simulation, we have thrown inside our interventions, and look, with the green lines you can see the improvement. Gray, yes. With the gray bars there, you can see the improvement. You see how much the situation can be improved if there is a model in place. So, if we go back to that slide where we can see the need for renewable energy, need for specialized renewable energy, etc., those models can really cover those aspects, all those aspects. So, going to my concluding remarks, I think that renewable energies and national Pacific state governments do really well. They work greatly. However, they need specialized modeling tools. The ambassador of Marshall Islands yesterday said that there is a problem in that the political leaders are changing the whole time, so opinions change the whole time, which is, of course, very much correct, very much right. If you have a model in place and you have data, and you can run those models and you have specific outcomes, then leaders that change cannot change too much on their national planning. The tools give confidence, offer punctuality, and guidance. Okay? Private sector is going to be happy to know that they can work better and more accurately. And local communities too, and governments too. Everybody can take benefit. And the tools should be used in all levels at the same time. We have those beautiful regional agencies around us. Nobody else has in the world. You know, it's like, I mean, everybody's working at that almost for the region right now, okay, at the global level. There is such a huge development effort in all aspects, and international effort, national efforts, etc. It's piece of cake, really. Beautiful minds around as well, as yesterday it was mentioned, again from the ambassador of Marshall Islands. So it's piece of cake to just throw there some tools and make them work and see how you can go to better results over time. So there is no time to risk failure. Thank you very much for your attention. Thank you.
Thank you, Michaela. Now, for giving the in-depth analysis of the various models, especially the M and M. Our next speaker this morning is Dr. Matthew Donnan, and he is a Deputy Director of Development and Policy Center at ANU. I have much pleasure to invite you.
All right. Well, thank you very much. Well, hello again. I think it's clear to everyone in this room, and also clear from Eva's presentation, that there is quite a remarkable energy transition that is now taking place. It's taking place globally, but it's also taking place in the Pacific. And that's especially evident when you look at the very ambitious renewable energy targets that have been established here. I was initially going to present this paper, and that's what's in the program, which is something I prepared with Kalim Shah from Indiana University. He works on the Caribbean. I've worked in the Pacific. But I decided instead that I might present something a little broader, really more of a reflection than a research piece as such. And I'm hoping to be a little controversial in my comments in order to spark some discussion. What I want to focus on is the role of government and the role of development partners or donors in that energy transition that I just mentioned here in the Pacific. And in keeping with the focus of this panel, I'm going to restrict my comments to the electricity sector. So let me begin with a very basic, simple question. Why develop renewable energy resources? I ask this question because there are numerous objectives behind the development of renewable energy resources, behind investments in renewable energy technologies. Looking at these objectives can help inform our thinking about how best to manage trade-offs that are involved in the development of renewable energy resources, how to manage trade-offs relating to resource allocation more broadly in Pacific Island countries. The objectives behind renewable energy development are also an important consideration for donors seeking to ensure that aid funds are used effectively. So, why develop renewable energy resources? I can think I guess I can group objectives into two categories. Perhaps the most obvious grouping is environmental. Key among environmental objectives are efforts to address climate change, which is obviously a significant concern in the region. That climate change focus, it's understandable. Nevertheless, I think a number of questions can be raised if this is the primary objective behind renewable energy development. There are ethical questions, questions related to justice. So if the Pacific has contributed and continues to contribute so little towards global warming, why must it shoulder such a large burden when bigger polluters like Australia have done comparatively little? There are questions around effectiveness. The Pacific contributes very little to global greenhouse gas emissions. Even if it reduced all of its emissions to zero, there would be very little global impact, not without action from the big polluters. And even there, Australia is irrelevant. We're really talking about China, the US. And linked to this, there are questions about cost. So imagine for a minute that you were a global planner who had as his or her objective lowering greenhouse gas emissions. The cheapest carbon emission reductions are to be had outside of the Pacific. Countries like Australia, whose electricity sectors are very reliant on coal, especially Victoria with brown coal. Looking outside of the electricity sector as well, deforestation, peatland fires in Indonesia. A second group of objectives behind renewable energy development relates to economic objectives. And I have to admit, these are the objectives that I find more convincing. There are very solid economic grounds on which to invest in renewable energy technologies in the Pacific. And Eva has already highlighted some of those, so I won't go into any detail. For households that are not connected to the electricity grid, there's also a very solid case for renewable energy technology as a means of expanding access to electricity. And again, that was covered somewhat in the last presentation. The challenge in developing those off-grid systems has always been institutional. The Pacific has a very poor record. If you look back to the 1980s, 1990s, there's a very poor record on the installation of, say, solar home systems in households. Why? Because there weren't appropriate institutional supports for their continued maintenance. I think the technology has improved to such an extent that that is a less important concern now than it was in the past, but nevertheless it is a concern. And institutional questions such as appropriate tariff setting really do need to be addressed in order for successful rural electrification, off-grid electrification, to take place. Renewable energy development in the electricity grid, it can be pursued for economic reasons, but it can also, and there are clear cost advantages for many renewable energy resources, it can also reduce financial risk in the network as a whole. And this was something that I looked into with Professor Frank Yotso in a paper that we published in 2015. This was a model of Fiji's electricity grid, and what we basically established was that investments in renewable energy technologies that the FEA had flagged did reduce both the average levelised generation cost for the grid, but also reduced financial risk. And that's because once an investment in a renewable energy technology takes place, the cost is basically known. That's not the case for diesel generators, where ongoing costs are subject to oil price volatility. So, there are two sets of objectives, environmental and economic. Insofar as resources are allocated to renewable energy development, be they government resources, be they donor resources, there are inevitably trade-offs that need to be considered. So, let's take as an example investment in rural as opposed to urban areas. Most electricity in the Pacific is consumed in urban areas, if you exclude mining operations which generate their own electricity. What does that mean for renewable energy development? Well, if the primary objective of renewable energy development is the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, the logical course of action is to focus on the electricity grid. Rural areas are irrelevant. They don't, at least the electricity consumption of rural areas is irrelevant. They don't produce large greenhouse gas emissions. If the objective behind renewable energy investments is, say, the national economy, concerns about the impacts of oil price volatility on the balance of payments, the focus will also be on urban areas. Again, the majority of diesel fuel that is consumed for electricity production is consumed in those urban grids, not in rural areas. On the other hand, if you take a broader view of development, if you're interested in poverty alleviation, then the focus is more likely to be on electricity access in those rural areas. And in the Pacific, 70% of the population is without electricity. It's 50% if you exclude PNG. That really does require a focus on rural areas. Most unelectrified households reside in rural areas. There are also broader trade-offs between allocating resources to renewable energy development and to other priorities. Think health and education, for example. So these again need to be considered by governments, by donors in their investments. Going back to the objectives behind renewable energy development can also help to inform the type of development that takes place. So if the primary objective behind renewable energy development relates to greenhouse gas emission reductions, it makes sense to have very high renewable energy targets. It also makes sense to look beyond the electricity sector, but I won't go into that. If the objectives are purely economic, targets are also likely to be high, but they won't be as high. The storage costs do remain a barrier to targets of say 100%. They are quite costly. I don't want to make too much of that point because I'm conscious that the cost of technology is changing so rapidly. There are also trade-offs with regard to prices. So everyone wants cheap electricity. I remember when the government in 2008 here increased the electricity price. It was front page on the newspaper. Many governments in the Pacific have subsidised electricity prices in the past, and that can be done in a targeted fashion. It should be done in a targeted fashion, as occurs here in Fiji now, but it's often not done in a targeted fashion. These are universal subsidies for everyone, and that was the case in Fiji in the past as well. Now, low prices obviously affect consumer behaviour. Low prices encourage the wastage of electricity, they discourage energy efficiency. That has implications for greenhouse gas emissions. And I would say there is considerable wastage of electricity in the Pacific, despite the very ambitious green focus of governments in the region. Now, you might have gathered by now that a key argument that I want to make here is that policies are important, they matter. And I really can't stress that enough. In a highly regulated sector, such as the electricity sector, investment isn't just going to be spontaneous, even where investments in renewable energy do make economic sense. Renewable energy targets, they mean very little unless they're underpinned by an adequate policy framework that encourages development of those renewable energy resources. There need to be incentives in place for investments in renewable energy, for investments in energy efficiency. That means prices that cover costs, that provide adequate returns to investors, to the utility. And I think we've seen over decades elected officials have proven not to be very good at providing such prices. The political incentives against increasing the price of electricity in response to cost increases are simply too great. It happened here in Fiji, but it happened before the transition to democracy. So, an independent regulator, be that an actual organisation or simply a board even that meets periodically in the smaller states, that's more likely to be successful in establishing appropriate prices. However, establishing such structures in very small states, I'm thinking of Nauru, Tuvalu, Niue, is problematic simply because of the fixed costs involved in establishing such structures. For energy efficiency, prices are also important, but so too are other policies, mandatory energy performance standards, for example, energy labelling, both of which improve energy efficiency. And it's good to see a number of countries in the region moving towards implementing such arrangements. For private sector that wants to invest, or even for households wanting to install solar panels on their roofs, there need to be appropriate legal frameworks in place that facilitate those actions. Often legislation has prevented that. It's prevented that in Vanuatu in recent years. For the private sector, there also needs to be an adequate feed-in tariff in place and adequate purchase power arrangements. And once again, these should be determined by an independent arbiter, not by the power utility. The FEA used to determine feed-in tariffs, and it led to not very much investment. It needs to be the regulator that determines those prices. And as I said, the policies are important. So targets are not enough. They can be helpful in signalling the country's direction. But to be so, they also need to be realistic. And they need to be realistic, they need to be developed in consultation with the sector. They need to consider the objectives behind renewable energy development and the trade-offs that are involved, some of those trade-offs that I've just mentioned. Otherwise, they're fragile. They're not met, they're postponed. And we've seen in a number of countries, including in this one, the postponement of very ambitious renewable energy targets time and time again. I want to wrap up by talking about the role of donors in renewable energy development. And I'd encourage you to read this fantastic article, which is a few years old, by Mark Puntain and William Pizer, which was published in Climate Policy. The role of aid for renewable energy development has generally been seen to be one of additionality. So aid would fund renewable energy investments where the market would not, generally because they were too costly, they were not attractive enough for the private sector. That role, I think, increasingly is superfluous, where you have a situation, as we see now, where renewable energy technologies are in fact cost competitive with oil-fired generation. Increasingly, according to these authors, we've seen a shift, this is internationally, towards use of aid as a catalyst for renewable energy investment by the market. So not for additionality or cases where investment wouldn't otherwise occur, but instead renewable energy projects that occur in commercially viable spaces as a demonstration project. How successful has it been? Well, their answer, according to these authors, is not very. They find that there's no evidence of a catalytic effect. And worse than that, they see that increased donor investments in projects they see higher levels of donor investment in countries where there is already private sector investment in renewable energy. And I say worse because this is likely to have the opposite impact. Rather than catalysing investment, it's likely to crowd out renewable energy investment by the private sector. So that's the risk. There are obviously reasons behind that. Donors have their own incentive structures. They want to ensure that their projects succeed, that aid funds are spent, and so forth. But according to these authors, these investments haven't achieved the catalytic effect that has often been claimed. And they conclude by arguing that donors should instead be directing their renewable energy investments into support for policies for regulatory structures, not a solar farm, not a wind farm. Now, that study is international. It's not. I'm not aware of any similar study in the Pacific, but I think it would be a really interesting exercise to undertake. So, stay tuned for next year. But I have some reason to think that donors in the Pacific do focus more on policy relative to donors in other parts of the world. So this graph I constructed using data from the OECD. And it says as much. I'm conscious the data is imperfect, but it shows that the difference between donor spending on renewable energy projects and policy support is greater in other developing countries than in the Pacific. So donors in the Pacific focus more on policy support relative to other regions. However, they still spend more on renewable energy projects than they do on policy support. And this takes me back to the objectives behind renewable energy development. So if economic objectives are primary, in my view they should be, then direct donor funding of renewable energy projects is unlikely to make sense. It's better to focus on getting the policies right, on getting the regulatory frameworks in place in order to facilitate investment by the market. There are, of course, exceptions. There are market failures which prevent private sector investment. So donor financing may be justified where credit markets are imperfect, where they create credit constraints on investment in the sector. I'm conscious there are also exceptions in the case of very small island states. Again, I'm thinking of countries like Tuvalu, like Nauru, where scale really prevents the establishment of those regulatory structures. Nevertheless, a focus on policy support, in my view, should be the priority in most of the Pacific, so as to avoid crowding out, in recognition that grant-funded infrastructure has been problematic in the Pacific in the past. It's often done more harm than good, burdening power utilities with inappropriate equipment. And perhaps most importantly, because aid funds could be used in other areas where their impacts on poverty would be greater. So I'm going to finish there. If I were to summarise my presentation, I guess there are three main points. First, I highlighted the importance of a clear strategy behind renewable energy development, the importance of clear objectives, because those objectives inform how a country negotiates those inevitable trade-offs that I discussed, and they also inform how renewable energy can best be developed. Second, I outlined the importance of policy, some of the requirements for the development of renewable energy resources, for investments in energy efficiency, And then lastly, I talked about the role of donors, which I feel can be most useful in the policy space rather than in funding these isolated projects that are economically viable in any case. And I think that that does occur to a great extent in the Pacific. I'm not saying it doesn't, but I think we can go further. So, thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Dunnan, for a very stimulating, and encouraging outline of the role of government and development partners in the electricity sector, and particularly the importance of energy policies and regulatory framework. Now, our next center, with much pleasure, I invite Dr. Taniela Faletau. He is Environment and Social Safeguards Officer at Pacific Sub-Regional Office, ADB.
Thank you. Just before I begin, I want to acknowledge the Pacific Department Renewable Energy team whose hard work I'm presenting today. Noting the time limit, I'll try to keep this short and as painless as possible. The presentation is twofold. The first part of the presentation, I'll talk about existing energy operations of the bank in the Pacific, and the second is I'll go into the pipeline of what the bank has got currently planned for renewable energy in our Pacific member states. Eva and Matthew have covered this comprehensively in their two presentations, but I'll just want to reiterate here very quickly. The Pacific challenge, of course, is very unique. As you can see up there, the dependence on fossil fuels, the vulnerability to fluctuating market oil prices, our geographical constraints, outdated power infrastructures, high tariffs, transmission and distribution losses. These are all challenges that ADB's Pacific developing member countries all share. And the existing operations is attempting to address these very clear constraints. I'm sure you've all seen this document. It's available outside. This is the recent ADB's recent Renewable Energy Update 2017. So this presentation is basically a brief summary of what's in this booklet. If you get a chance, please pick up one outside. It covers in detail specifically our existing operations and what's planned in the pipeline for the future. It's available online as well, and basically it covers the core activities that the bank is implementing, the impacts they produce, and of course what is aimed to be achieved in the future. Basically, the bank's existing operations the approach is a free-tired approach to promote energy efficiency and renewable energy, to maximize access to energy for all, and to promote energy sector reform, capacity building, and effective governance. I'm quite surprised. I'm quite glad that you came up with that new FIMANGO. I think that's probably what we're going to call it, Eva, from now on. But those basically are the three major tiers that the bank is addressing for its energy operations. Now, basically, the access to modern energy services is not only increasing does not mean we only increase renewable energy generation. It also means increasing our distribution efficiency. I think Matthew touched on that as well with transmission. More importantly, there's also a need here to ensure efficient use of resources, especially in partnership, not only with the public and private, but as well as with other donors. This is very, very critical, and I've sort of highlighted it there. The role that partnerships play within country and regionally, as well as bilateral and multilateral, is very important. The existing renewable energy portfolio covers currently 10 Pacific countries, which is Cook Islands, Fiji, FSM, the Marshalls, Nauru, Papua New Guinea, Samoa, Solomons, Tonga, and Vanuatu. There's also a regional initiative that will be the second part of this presentation. In total, the bank has a current Pacific energy sector portfolio of 355 million, pipeline of 17 projects in 11 Pacific countries, which is worth about 725. With that partnership that I was talking about, there's projected to be co-financing from other partners of up to 450 million. Like I said, this little booklet, very important, covers in detail everything that the bank is doing in renewable energy in the Pacific. Just to touch on a few, the orange is ongoing technical assistance and projects in the Pacific right now in the existing portfolio. I know you can't really see it really well, but in green, completed technical assistance in Papua New Guinea and Solomons, I think. And in blue is the regional initiative that's in the pipeline, which will be the second part will form the second part of this presentation. So as you can see, ranging from East Timor to Cook Islands in the east, that the portfolio is quite vast and covers a combination of solar, wind, hydropower to local rural electrification projects. Again, this little booklet, very important. I've selected about four current projects here just to highlight some of the achievements made. This is the Tonga Outer Island Renewable Energy Project. It consists of constructing solar generation systems in 9 outer islands of Tonga, from Ewa in the south all the way to the Niuas in the north. The photo taken here is of the Hapai Island component of the project. This was just last week commissioned by the Australian High Commissioner, and it provides this particular island for the first time with 50% renewable energy penetration into the grid, which is not only a first for the island, but a first for the whole country as well. Tonga is currently 13% renewable, and the project, upon its completion, will hopefully reach about 30 to 35% renewable. The Tonga's target for 2020 is 50% and 100% by 2030. This is the famous Samoa Renewable Energy rehabilitation and expansion project. In the picture there you can see this project arose out of the impacts of Cyclone Evan back in 2012. Run-of-the-river schemes, small hydro schemes. The pen stocks were above ground, so they got destroyed by the flood as well as falling trees. This project is looking to add additional hydropower capacity, as well as rehabilitate the existing 5 small hydro schemes that were destroyed in the flood and the cyclone. Samoa was 33% renewable before Cyclone Evan, and after the project should be over 50%. So the climate change aspect to this is now they're burying the penstocks underground to make it more climate resilient. This is the Cook Islands Renewable Energy Project. This project is installing solar generation on 5 outer islands and battery energy storage system on Rarotonga, which is in the photo. The photo here is an existing solar PV array that was built by New Zealand, and the project is installing new battery energy storage systems to stabilize the grid because of the fluctuation. The Cooks was 15% before the project, and after the project will be 50% renewable. A national target of 100% by the government is set for 2020. Last of the projects that, or the interventions that I've picked is, of course, our host country here, Fiji. As you know, Fiji's newly revised sector policy sets the target of 99% renewable generation by 2030 and 100% electrification rate by 2020. Achieving these goals, of course, will require significant investment, approximately 760 million over the coming decade. They've requested the bank back in 2015 to develop the institutional capacity for regulation in anticipation of these interventions, and as well as to develop a sector investment planning framework. So technical assistance has been mobilized. The approved TA comprises 2 outputs: capacity building for selected regulatory agencies and enhanced sector planning capacity at a relevant government department. The former is reviewing the existing legal institutional framework to identify the government agency to serve as the regulatory body. It will also provide training and recommendation on legislation to enable this certain agency to discharge its functions appropriately. The second output will consist of detailed recommendations for establishing a policy framework that will identify, select, and implement potential energy investment options. I think that completes, I've only selected 4 out of the vast portfolio that the bank and its operations in the Pacific. Like I said, the rest, all the projects are in this little document. I'll move on now to the future pipeline that the bank has. And again, there is, like Eva alluded to in her presentation, a distinct regional challenge. Isolated communities spread across vast ocean distances with different economies, jurisdictions. There's a clear recognition that regional approaches must deliver regional solutions, which capitalize on economies of scale and lower transaction costs. This has led to the formation of the Pacific Renewable Energy Investment Facility that the bank has recently set up. The approach is for a single large-scale initiative whereby regional stakeholders ensure development efforts are well planned and meet shared goals. The investment facility basically is a response to ad hoc project implementation and processing. So the process of administering finance is very similar for the amount of effort put in is very similar for different projects of varying sizes. So it can be time consuming. So the basic idea is to achieve a paradigm shift whereby you, instead of you bundle them all into one, and then from there you could meet shared procurement rules. I'll go into more detail about this approach later on, But in support of this, back in 2013, a group of partners got together, donor partners got together and set up the Pacific Regional Infrastructure Facility. It's officed in Sydney and covers the 5 economic infrastructure subsectors, which is energy, ICT, road, aviation, maritime transport, urban development, and water sanitation. Now, this community of practice, basically each has a sector working group, and they meet 4 times a year, and ADB serves as the executive agency. So this is one of the major mechanisms that we're helping to coordinate the regional and donor effort. Now, in more detail, the Renewable Energy Facility, the objective is to streamline donor investments into 11 of the Pacific SIDS. It will accomplish this by financing a series of individual renewable energy projects and overseeing energy sector reform. One can't go without the other. The facility anticipates providing development support for 20 separate renewable energy projects over the next 5 years. It's in 2 outputs. Output 1 is estimated to include installation of 80 megawatt of combined solar, wind, and hydropower generation capacity, installation of 30 megawatt battery storage, construction, rehabilitation of 300 kilometers of transmission and distribution lines, refurbishment of 5 diesel plants to improve energy efficiency, and implementation of 4 rural electrification projects. Output 2 will support all these activities through energy sector reforms, the promotion of private sector engagement, preparation of further investment channels, and the dissemination of best practices and lessons learned. I'm quite glad to see that maybe the bank is on the right track here. Now, the program's comparative advantage, like I said earlier, but in more detail now, it addresses a number of regional barriers by supporting improved sector reform on a regional basis, knowledge transfer between sub-projects in a single program, improved procurement procedures from centralized management unit, improved sector planning due to long-term financing security, and promotion of the private sector engagement across the whole program. So these are clear advantages of having this in place. For the Pacific countries, the lessons learned from the transformation of small island grids will be replicable in other regions and other countries. The program also will support the energy targets, the proposed investments already identified by the countries as national priorities. Again, this is under the national energy sector development plans as priority areas under their NDCs. And of course, if there is an existing renewable energy program in country, then you can just upscale and build upon on those successful initiatives. Sector reform is of course an integral part of this. Sector planning, power utility management reform and capacity building, tariff review and reform, review and revision of regulatory and policy frameworks, and of course promoting private sector by identifying opportunities for IPPs and PPPs. And this, of course, the bank also has our private sector development initiative, which is also based in Sydney, and they provide transaction advice in designing guarantee products. Now, importantly, the paradigm shift that this program hopes to achieve, first of all, is a transition to low carbon energy sector. The program, of course, will create a paradigm shift by supporting the countries to overcome the investment and technical barriers to higher integration percentages of renewable energy. Got a note here that says Now, technical integration of intermittent renewable energy poses significant challenges on small island grids managed by utilities with relatively low capacity. So, with the investment intervening to aid that integration, then that gap is actually closed. 2 is the private sector engagement, of course. The program will support paradigm shift, introducing private sector support structural shift. This will be particularly important in Pacific countries which are unable to mobilize sufficient sovereign financing and require technical support to manage the transition. And finally, energy access. There are existing significant disincentives that Matthew and them have alluded to, whereby Pacific power utilities increase customers for high-cost diesel-based generation centers. The grid extensions, although are very essential, but most Pacific countries lack the budget or the support to support rural and outer island electrification programs. Renewable energy for rural and outer island electrification offers a paradigm shift, as low-cost power generation will allow power utilities to extend through employing cheaper, more affordable hybrid models. So having hydro complement diesel generation, as well as solar PV arrays complement diesel generation, makes it much more affordable. Let's conclude just on a parting note. The facility has had one great success. The facility applied on behalf of the Cook Islands last year and managed to obtain from the GCF approximately $12 million to install the battery energy storage system on Rarotonga. And in the pipeline now, the facility is currently helping Samoa with a big flood control dam, which will be processed through this facility, as well as Tonga, which is proposing an expansion on the Outer Island Renewable Energy Project to cover the whole country. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Faletau, for your very inspiring and, could say, exciting outline of the, the scenarios you gave for the region, and of course, the three-tier approach, the role of the bank, and the functions there. Now, from this morning, what we have gathered, let me give you a quick rundown. The status of the renewable energy in the region. Now, one of the panel members have pointed out that we spend around $725 million. Now, if you compare that with the actual annual money spent on a global scale, which is around 242 billion USD, then it is, of course, we are less than, say, 0.4%. So it's, it's that small. And the other thing is in terms of the capacity that we have got. One of our panel members rightfully mentioned that the renewable energy capacity is around 250 megawatts. And if you compare that with the global annual installation, which is around 216 gigawatts last year, so this is less than 0.1% we did in the last 25 years. Also, from this morning's presentation, there were two key points which came out very strongly, and these are, there is a need for a special tool to actually work in the renewable energy area. The tool means in terms of the modeling. And the other thing that came out very strongly is on policy and regulatory framework. Now with that, now I open the floor for critique and discussions and questions.
My name is Christian Furr, and I'm Chair for Electric Power Corporation in Samoa. And I suppose I make a comment. In Samoa, our Prime Minister made a huge statement he's a politician, so he said 100% by 2018. As chairman that's responsible for delivering upon that, it was a very, very optimistic promise. And unfortunately, there are lessons to be learned. The economics of renewable, from a board point of view, are very challenging at best. Okay, fully support what Matthew said. There's some great work being done by the development agencies in Samoa, Asian Development Bank, through a lot of the hydro schemes, and that's going to deliver a lot for Samoa. The thing is, Samoa got really deep into the IPPs, and we've got 3 IPPs in Samoa. The economics of those are not great, which is going to the point that Matthew made, that the need for support along the regulatory support for it, the economics of renewable, I can't support that anymore. So we're trying to deal with these IPPs and PPAs, which are a lot more expensive and had the effect of increasing power in Samoa. So thank you for your sharings, and the development partners are here and they're doing great work on developing infrastructure plant. I think we need to sort of overlay that with a very strong economic analysis. We're fortunate that when we discovered that we were in a bit of trouble, New Zealand MFAT came into our support and they've been helping us. But I think for other islands who are going to go towards this private-public partnerships with IPPs, I would strongly recommend that they ask for the support in the sort of policy area. But thank you very much. This has been a very interesting and a great experience to learn.
Thank you. Got one up there.
Yeah, thank you. Maybe I can just begin with a comment which attributed to what the chair has said. I think it's amazing how one can use statistics, but the statistics which is actually quite important for the Pacific is, notwithstanding the small numbers, many countries' fossil fuel imports account for over 50-60% of their total imports, so hence the case for renewable energy. Now my particular questions and comments are firstly to Eva, and I would like to thank her for a very candid presentation. I think it's very refreshing to see a very good analysis. I think I have been involved with the NDC preparations and some of this work in the region, and I agree completely with you, and perhaps the sentiment which you may not have made that directly, that a lot of these targets may have been based on perhaps conjectures or perhaps not proper analysis. And I think the message you are trying to give is the need to look at, do a reality check. And I agree in terms of some of the targets which have been given, which is being bandied around, and in particular the way the NDCs have been developed. And I think part of the problem with the NDC development in the region, and most of them were done before Paris, where they were just done to tick the box without a proper inclusive process. And as the gentleman from Samoa had said, I mean, the NDC development really requires a holistic approach where the private sector, the NGOs, the governments, all the participants in the country need to be on the same page in terms of how practical it is to implement some of these measures to get there, and what it takes for a country to be able to achieve those targets. And I think my real question in relation to that, Eva, to you is how much energy efficiency should really contribute to that target, and how it could help attain that particular target. And following on from that, let me also raise a question in relation to what Daniela had said. You talked about 760 million investment which will help Fiji achieve its target. Is that true? I mean, is that what the bank has done any work to sort of say that using 760 million additional funds, it will help Fiji achieve its 99% renewable energy target by 2030? I think the point I'm trying to make is a lot of the activities which is outlined in this book are very all novel and very useful. But there is one element which I find extremely lacking is the capacity building element for governments and for countries. I mean, okay, it's the same old story. We've had renewables for a long time, but without the maintenance, without the upskilling the communities who can maintain these sort of equipment and so on. And how much of that is featured in PRIF's projects and activities? Thank you.
Eva, I'd like to answer first.
No? Yes. Okay. Mahendra, thank you very much for your questions. Just give me some time. I would like to make a point to the gentleman from Samoa first, and then I will come back to you. It happened that I have worked recently with GGGI, and we have done the solar mapping of solar grid systems around the Pacific region. I have to say that I was very impressed with Samoa. Samoa does very, very well, actually great. In the solar sector, I'm very, very much optimist for the future regarding renewable energy in Samoa. And apart from the IPP's agreements that I fully agree with you, they're very, very strong. The other things for Samoa is that, and please correct me if I'm wrong, your huge asset is you have a very, very strong central utility, public state utility that works very well with the government in place. And your other asset is that islands are close, and you don't have this big burden of transferring knowledge and experience from the one island to the other, like for example in Fiji or in other island nations. Because we have to take into consideration that in this region, those practical things, although they look of limited importance, in the end they make a huge difference. So congratulations to Samoa, and it really goes very, very well in so many aspects. Now, Mahendra, I cannot answer to you right now the energy efficiency rate. Well, according to our research, which is under review by now, it's not published yet, I think with an expected future increase of 2% rather than 4%, and a nice mixture of solid and renewable energy, it could work. However, we really need good data to put down in the model to be able to tell accurately. We also need to take into consideration other parameters, like the grid accessing grids, as my colleagues have mentioned many times. There are plans by Asian Development Bank and by other development partners that grids are going to improve in time. So what we really need to do is to sit down with a great set of data and the pipeline planning, what's going to happen in the future, so as we have accurate results on how much energy efficiency we should have in order to attain the targets.
Thank you, Eva.
Sorry for being a bit,
Please be very brief with your questions and your answers. Can you pass it to...
Just in response to the figure, I think it's taken out of the government energy sector plan and adopted into this book as the official pipeline investment programming. In response to your second question, with the operational manuals and the capacity building that we're doing, I guess if we're talking on grid, then you have the local power utility. The problem gets more difficult when you go off grid to remote rural areas and outer islands. So most recently, as a lesson learned in Cook Islands and Tonga, with the drive of Australia and New Zealand who are co-financing, is that we've brought in capacity building, operation maintenance framework, as well as an implementation plan, so that after the investment is built, that some sort of island council or some sort of hybrid system is put in place to continue that maintenance work that is missing in rural areas. And I think that would be that's probably the way forward. It's still new. They're still trialing and piloting this new method, but I think over the next couple of years we'll get down to something that's very effective.
Thank you. We just have time for one brief question.
Thank you. The question is probably not a question but a clarification from Matthew. On the issue, I think you had mentioned about the fact that donor governments should be more interested in the policy rather than the other way around. But Taniela is talking about things are happening now. So I was a bit confused, what angle are we taking? That's the first one, probably you can clarify that. The second is the issue about generally, I don't know, probably the three of you can respond to. In terms of the cost, I'm just a consumer. As a consumer, with all these energy renewable issues that are happening, in the Pacific, how does the cost affect me as a consumer? That's really the question. And over the long term, will that reduce? For instance, in Fiji, we heard so much at one time when the hydroelectric big thing was here, but the cost kept on increasing. So I'm not too sure. So that's basically what I wanted some clarification from the panel. Thank you.
So perhaps first on the cost. I think Fiji's a little unique in that it benefited for decades from the World Bank funded Monosabu scheme, and that enabled the FEA to provide electricity at a very low cost. That hydropower resource has been utilised, and schemes like Nandarivatu are run-of-the-river schemes, so the cost is more expensive. They're more likely to stop operating when there are dry spells. So personally, I don't see electricity prices ever really coming down, and I think they were artificially low in the past because of that subsidised Monosabu scheme, which was in place for many years and which really provided the bulk of Fiji's electricity. On your more difficult first question, I did say at the outset that I was trying to be controversial, and I meant it. I actually have a lot of questions about why private sector investment has not been more forthcoming in the Pacific. For many years, I thought it was because of the small size of Pacific Island countries. Companies simply weren't interested. I no longer think that's the case. Look at MFAT, has been providing constructing a lot of renewable energy projects in the region. They had no trouble in getting New Zealand companies on board to implement those projects. So I'm unclear myself as to why that private sector investment has not been forthcoming. I suspect it has to do with regulatory frameworks. Fiji's case, for example, on the surface, the regulatory framework was sound. The FEA had established concessions for establishment of biomass plants, but there were flaws in the contract which prevented that from happening. Basically, there was no requirement from the companies that had purchased those concessions to actually develop those plans, and those companies didn't have the financing available. So I'm not saying that there's no scope for donor-funded projects. There clearly is, and that's because of those sort of market failures. But I do think that the focus should be on establishing the policy framework for investment from the private sector, from existing utilities as well. And I also think that the likes of the ADB do walk a fine line in, on the one hand, promoting private sector investment and providing that very helpful TA, which the gentleman from Samoa pointed out, but at the same time in funding renewable energy projects, the risk, of course, is always that those projects might crowd out that private sector investment.
Can I have a comment on the cost? Is it possible?
Just very briefly, please.
Very briefly, yes. I would just like to mention the case of my country, Greece. And as I said, I was in the regulator, so we had the same problem exactly. Unfortunately, the cost has been higher and higher because of the introduction of renewable energy for consumers. So that needs a specific approach, because up to now the renewable energy was for free for everybody because they were funded projects, but from now on might be private sector means that they're going to ask subsidization from the state. So this price is going to be over to consumers. So I think what the consumers need to do is really to take up energy efficiency measures and reduce their electricity consumption as much as possible. And from the government side, what needs to be done is that they control and monitor the whole time the situation for the consumers and not only for the private sector or for the targets they have to attain, etc., etc. For one reason, if consumers get dissatisfied with renewable energy because they have to pay too much, they're going to be against them, and that's not very good for the national policy. So that's the solution. I mean, the regulator together with the state, they should be above consumers the whole time. Consumers should be their first priority, and then everything else will come softly.
Thank you. In the view of the time, I thank the panel for your very illuminating and thought-provoking presentation. And to you all, very much appreciated your patience and your interest in this session. Now I draw the session to a close.
We're inviting everyone to join us for lunch. It's at the tent right across, right outside the auditorium. So everybody, please free to join us for lunch. Thank you.